Welcome to Scribbler to Scribe. I'm your host, David Scribbler Wishart, and I'm joined by my co-host, resident scribe, Pastor Ronnie Smith from Peace Lutheran Church. We invite you on a spiritual journey to explore questions of faith in the human experience. If you're searching for more meaning in your life, you're not alone. So join us as we search for wisdom and personal growth through a theological lens.
Let's use this to switch to something a little different, because I had an idea I think it's kind of neat. I want to just work through it with you. So you think about Jesus and the time when, he arrived and became like maybe there was an existential crisis of his time, and that he was the person who was there at the time that was that figure was needed. And he's so important historically because there was a point in humanity when he arrived where it was on the precipice of crumbling in some fashion. And so you think about some of the figures throughout history who maybe have served a similar function, like someone like Martin Luther King Jr., for example, and the civil rights movement. Or today you'd say maybe climate change is an existential crisis, and there's somebody who comes out of that, who is the leader that we all kind of needed at that time. And you can't really see it maybe in the moment, but only in hindsight does it become clear that that person was extremely important.
Right.
They were a pivotal turning point for where we were as the human race. So I guess what I'm getting at is, what were the conditions of the time when he came to be? And is that possible that that's what it was? And is there, I say that in obviously there's something, bigger about him than anybody else, given that, it's the most talked about story of all time. But to just think about, is that maybe an example of also anybody finding their time, that their cause and in their time to sort of rise up like Jesus did and be that person. So whatever that meandering question is in there, but it's just, what are your thoughts about that? So first we'll start with, what was the historical environment in which he came about, and what were the problems in that world that maybe he needed to be there to solve? And then secondly, in relation to this sort of idea of, maybe Jesus wasn't a perfect dude, but he was the perfect person for the time that he came to the world. And how can we be that person as well? How do we sort of be what the world needs for us today?
And for me, he doesn't need to be perfect. I don't need him to be perfect to be who he is, I guess. I don't need, Jesus of Nazareth sort of transcends himself when he becomes Christ, essentially. And then maybe we can start to talk about perfection. But Jesus, the man who lived, who, was born, was a baby, grew up, and then had a very powerful ministry, doesn't need to be perfect to me. His teachings are so powerful. I guess it transcends all of that too, in some way. But the context of the time was very wrought with turmoil. So Roman scholars may be able to correct me, but is more or less the peak of the Roman Empire, peak of their power. They've expanded quite heavily already. They've taken over what we now call the Holy Land. And basically they sort of allowed this temple culture to happen. The religious life was allowed to happen there. It's kind of occupying 101, right? You don't want to take everything from people. You want to show them who's boss, but you want to let them have their own little thing there to keep the peace. And then so you appoint a local governor and local muscle to sort of enforce your reign, I guess. But they were terrorizing the whole world essentially, or the whole world as they knew it at that time. And so there's two big forces here. One is the occupation of a foreign power, and then on the inside you had the corruption of the religious leaders, as we talked about with the whole racket around burnt offerings and sacrifices and all that stuff. They had their own currency at the temple. So if you came to Jerusalem from middle of nowhere on your pilgrimage, you had to convert your money into temple money essentially, and then buy their products if you didn't have. So it was a real commercial enterprise, and that benefits not only them, but also the Romans, who are ultimately putting their thumb on everyone and taking whatever they need to take. And so within that, there's great despair, there's destruction, there's violence. Society can be pretty disheveled in many kind of ways. And Jesus ultimately comes along and says, hey, that's not right. And we know what happens to people when they do that throughout history in the end. But his response was nonviolent, peaceful sort of preaching and protesting, I suppose we could say, which was very different when contrasted with the violence of the time. And not long after he dies, a few decades, the temple eventually gets destroyed and things like that. There are vultures all around the place looking to exploit the place. And that's knowing that really sort of magnifies the power of his ministry in a sense, because how could someone in that context be so committed to a peaceful resistance, I guess. Gandhi's another sort of human example of that, it's winning through nonviolence. And you mentioned Martin Luther King. These are a bit more contemporary to us. So very, very troubled time and place, and people had no hope. And here's a guy who comes and manages to kindle some hope, and is preaching with authority, we hear, and is performing miracles, and is healing people, and people have never seen this. And so there's definitely something of God about all of this. He was so great, they called him the Son of God, which was a fairly common thing to say back in those days, but then he becomes the Son of God. And then I guess in the Christian world, no one else is allowed to sort of take on that sort of name. But in those days, anybody who was righteous, was doing great things, could have been said to have been sons of God or daughters of God. Actually, Jesus, as far as we know, is the only one to name a daughter of God. Up to that point, he was very, very much about empowering women, lifting them up, using them for to perform acts of power and different things like that, which was also very radical in those days, because women were not very highly regarded, particularly widows. And we can thank the church. We can thank all the widows for really being the ones to build the church. It was the women who were at the foot of the cross on Good Friday. All the disciples got scared and ran off, which, I might do the same too. Who knows? I'm not there to judge them, but fact is that it was the women who really built the church. And yet it's become a very patriarchal institution, as we sort of talked about a little bit earlier. We talk about the church fathers, Augustine and all the great theologians over the centuries, but what about the church mothers? Like, they don't get nearly as much press. And you look at your average congregation, there's a lot more women involved, sort of with the holding up of the congregation.
Here's my takeaway from that, and it is, you have an environment where things get violent and corrupt, and you have a person who appears to provide others with an alternative, so to speak, and they do that in a non-violent way. I think that some of the best, major leaders or figures of history, you probably could go through and find that that sort of non-violent, peaceful protest aspect was a consistent factor. Because once violence becomes involved, it's so easy to become a villain. Because, even if it's your story, you could become the villain of somebody else's story. But when you do it in a peaceful manner, in a way that makes it difficult for others to even become defensive because you're not attacking them, it's much harder to do. And therefore you become much more, I'd say your cause becomes more resilient as well. So I'm just trying to think of, where we are today. And I feel like 2020 kind of was one of those years. There's lots, like, I think of, say, like the 1990s, for example, as a time when things were, and maybe it's just my own biased perspective because it wasn't a great time for everybody. But it felt like things were pretty stable and kind of in a good place. And that kind of since then, it's been kind of trending in the wrong direction. And it got really, everything came to a head last year. So the question, I guess, is like something or someone, is somebody going to emerge from that? I'm curious if we'll see that, here, or maybe we just won't see it until 20 years from now and be like, oh, remember that person, right?
Yeah.
But it seems unfortunate, though, that there's a degree of, heroism that needs to be had with that, because many of these people seem to meet untimely ends, that they're assassinated and they're silenced, and
Right.
that only through their death does their cause truly seem to blossom, and it's that's why many of us don't take up that mantle, because we have fear, we have too much to lose, so we're not willing to go that far, and that's what keeps the corrupt in power. So I don't know if we've got that person who's ready to be that yet or not, but I guess the question is, how do we feel inspired by the acts of Jesus to find that courage ourselves to be those types of people?
Right. Just one quick point. A lot of heroes, quote unquote heroes, have been very violent too, and yet we still hold them up through history. It's very rare that they're actually non-violent heroes. That's why they're so notable, I guess, and sort of stick out.
Well, history is written by the victors, I guess. So that's the thing, right?
Yeah. And that's another thing. Much of the Gospels are written in code because they were persecuted so heavily for the first few hundred years. There's a lot of secrets embedded in there. There's a reason why they don't. There's a reason why they're so sort of take it easy on the Romans in the Gospels, because if Roman officials come and see this stuff that you're sort of preaching against them, guess what happens to you? So that's why Pilate is sort of this sympathetic character that we sympathize with. Oh, it's like, oh, he tried to save him, but the Jews just wanted to kill him. So, it wasn't his fault. There's a reason why it's written like that. But in terms of the leader we need, I don't know, wouldn't it be nice if a whole bunch of us kind of got together and said, we're going to choose to live as if the kingdom of God has come near, and we're going to believe in that good news. We're going to repent and believe in that good news. It doesn't have to be some amazing, crazy, like ridiculously out there kind of person. It could be just regular folks doing their bit day
Well,
to day until you build a critical mass, I guess.
we talked about this before, is this idea of we can be paralyzed from engaging in action because we're always looking for the big thing. And if all of us collectively just engage in small acts of kindness, small acts of ways to improve our world, that the collective might of all of us is enormous and unstoppable. And it's only through, we're trapped in our thoughts rather than taking action because we feel like we have to make this grand gesture, or we're afraid of something, or whatever the case may be. But for sure, I think maybe that's the thing that we have forgotten, and it's what's going to be necessary for the next leg of humanity to thrive. And you can kind of think of in science fiction some of the stories like Star Trek, right, where at some point humanity sort of solves the resource problem, and then they come together and are basically travel the universe because they've solved all the earthly problems and there's nothing there left to do, and they want to go out and explore the depths of space. And I mean, there's plenty of violence and stuff in Star Trek, so don't get me wrong, it's not perfect or anything like that, but just I think that's what we could be capable of if we were able to collect together. But war is still a very regular part of life, whether it's overt or covert. But it's just surprising that we still can't get there. We're so far off from being able to see eye to eye.
Right. Yeah, it's incumbent upon each of us, and for too long we've sort of let other people do that work. Like even just something as simple as reading the Bible sounds ridiculous, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we all just read the Bible more, the world would be a better place. Why is that? Because the more you look at that, you start to see distortions all around you. You're going right to the source. You're not waiting to hear it, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, thousandth hand. Where's that third-handed economist?
Yeah, the invisible hand.
Yeah. We stopped doing that work ourselves, I guess, each of us, and we've just sort of accepted the common narrative of the church. And the more you investigate, the more you find out, the more you realize that, we've got some cleaning up to do. One of the most powerful things that Jesus says, in my view, I think it's Mark 8 somewhere. Anybody who wants to follow me, pick up your cross. How many people are out there saying, believe, I believe, so I'm saved, and Jesus died for my sins, so I'm good. But how many people are actually listening to what Jesus said? Those are things that the church said. Those aren't things that Jesus said. He said, you want to follow me, pick up your cross, or deny yourself and pick up your cross. So make your life of service to others. But how many people are out there, really following him up on that? There's lots of great people, don't get me wrong. And at our church, there's lots of great people serving our congregation and the whole church, and we're really blessed that way.
Well, I think that some of it is just too that you have to check in on yourself occasionally, and it's that we all have it in us to serve others more, but it's very easy to just fall into some kind of self-centered tendencies, especially when times are hard and you're feeling some difficulty. You kind of retreat inward, and I'm definitely guilty of it myself, and that it's more work to look outward. It's way more fulfilling when you finally do it, and you wonder why you never did, why you hadn't been for so long. But you can't be too hard on ourselves, but maybe there needs to be some kind of habit or practice that you engage in daily to just remind yourself to have gratitude and to make sure you're thinking of others. And do you have any habits that you do like that to just keep yourself centered? Wrong choice of words there. Not to keep yourself to center yourself.
Yeah, well, I don't know if this answers it, but well, I guess music is my vice of choice. I guess that's my happy place. But I guess, I felt strongly enough about it that I went into ministry, I guess. And, there's been plenty of blessings in my life. And I don't want to sound like I'm some martyr or anything like that, but I was intentional about that, like maybe kind of demanding more of ourselves, not letting ourselves off the hook so easily. Like everyone's so afraid to correct others or correct ourselves, or we're just a bit too casual, I guess, in demanding more from each other, holding each other to a higher standard.
Yeah.
And this is a great time to start doing that, I guess, because there's many challenges that we're all facing. And you talked about who's going to be the one to step up on the environmental front. That's going to take many nameless, faceless people pitching in. Like I've got a lot of faith in younger generations who see the seriousness of the mess that they've inherited and are actually coming up with solutions, like people that are designing things to like clean up plastic in the ocean and things like that.
Yeah.
Like very encouraging. But does anybody know their name? And I guess that's another sort of theme. And I don't know if you saw the Ash Wednesday service tonight. Part of the reading was like, if you're giving, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Or if you're praying, don't make a big fuss about it in public. Like do it privately on your own when nobody's watching, kind of thing. Yeah. So what do you do when nobody's watching? Doesn't have to be some big grand public display. In fact, it's even better if it's not. And Jesus wasn't out looking for press. He was just going around doing his thing, what he felt compelled to do, and left that to other people. And the Gospel of Mark's really interesting too, because I mentioned the Gospel of John has a lot of I am statements in it. But in Mark, there's something what scholars have dubbed the messianic secret, because every time Jesus does something, he's like, don't tell anybody about this. Heals a guy, don't tell anyone I did this. Transfiguration on the mountain, don't tell anybody about this till after it's the resurrection, essentially. So there's the Jesus we find in Mark, I guess, is a lot different than the average Jesus you find in the average church, I guess. There's a lot more down to earth, a lot more discreet, I suppose. Not out looking to make waves. That just sort of happens because the things he does end up being so great, and people can't help themselves. We do like to gossip. But yeah, and it doesn't have to be a religious thing either. Like, if you don't want to get into, you don't want to consider yourself religious or anything, way, like it's your civic duty. Demand more of each other from a civic perspective. Like, we need to be better. If anything, we take away from COVID, let's take that away, because the world was not going in a good direction for
No.
most people. And I just hope it was enough to sort of change hearts and set us back on a more sustainable, healthy path. That remains to be seen, I guess, but
I'm hopeful it has. And I think that, just talking to people, that I think there's a sense that change is in the air, and we're hoping to just kind of, we're trying to survive, not thrive through this current period. But when we come out the other side, I hope that we're reflective enough to appreciate that this was a very difficult period, but we've learned a lot about ourselves and about what we can do for our community. And me and you working on this podcast is one of those things where we're just seeing what can we do to help reinstill people's confidence and faith and in Jesus and God and the church, and just get people excited about that again. So we wouldn't have done this without that event. So
right.
I think it's got a lot of positive changes, and we're not the only ones who are having conversations that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So I definitely think that good things will come. We just have to make sure that we don't let a crisis go to waste, right? It's, we have to learn from these things. If we don't, then it's such a shame.
We hope you found your time nourishing and life-giving. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. If you would like to hear more and support the podcast and Peace Lutheran Church, please consider donating at the link in the description. For DW, I'm Pastor Ronnie Smith. Peace be with you.